Good morning. This is Jason Dean coming live at you again for another Film Fanatic show. It is 11:14 here on a Thursday. It's already a Thursday night, or Thursday during the day, I should say. Crazy, going by so quick. So yeah, very excited. I had a doctor's appointment yesterday up in Bangor, and it was early. It was early in the morning, but I had some time in between coming home. It's like an hour drive from here, so I had some time in between. So of course I went to Bull Moose. I hadn't actually been to Bull Moose in a little while. I've been trying to take a little not to make this sound or put it in a funny light, but I've been trying to take a break from going there as often as I was, only because I don't want to get in a place of where I'm just so inundated with movies that I don't actually get a chance to see. I don't want it to feel like I'm just doing it for the sake of doing it. I watch whenever I buy the movies. Whenever I buy movies, I try to watch them. But the thing is I have acquired a lot of movies this year. This year, 2024, is probably the biggest year as far as me buying movies, and I've gotten a ton of movies. So I want to and I rewatch movies all the time. Movies that I really love or that I'll go back to and revisit them multiple times. If I'm really into them, and I look at it like that. I want to ruminate with what I have, all my purchases for a while, and then when I feel like I've kind of had that experience or those experiences, rewatching some of these movies and a lot of these titles, a lot of these movies I bought I've never seen. So it's like a case of I want to live with it for a while, and then move on to buying some new movies. But yesterday I was in Bull Moose. I went to Bull Moose because I had some time and I got some movies that I'm super excited about. One in particular, which I'm really, really excited. I was super pumped about. It's a movie I've been wanting to see, and I'm going to do a show on it. I'm not going to say what movie it is, but I'm going to do a show on it probably tomorrow because I'm going to sit down tonight and watch the entire thing, which I'm super excited about because I have a crappy DVD version of it, and it's such an amazing movie. I watched it last week and I was blown away by it. I was like, you know what? I really need to get an upgrade for it. And I went to Bull Moose and they had it there, a really beautiful edition. So I'm super excited to watch it. I haven't been this excited for a while as far as movies that I have bought, in a recent time that I'm chomping at the bit to watch. I was gonna watch it last night, but I didn't sleep very well. I had only 2 hours of sleep yesterday, so I was kind of dragging ass all day. Plus, I worked and then I had a rehearsal, and by the time I got home it was 11:30, and I was I was kind of a little bit of a vegetable at that point. So I was like, I don't know if I really want to sit down, and I'm not going to really be able to focus on this movie. And it was late. I generally try not to start movies too late, like 11 o'clock. That's a little bit late. I do that, but a lot of times for obvious reasons I can't really concentrate on it. Plus, I eagerly really want to watch this, and I was, you know, uh, not functioning on a whole lot of sleep. So I'm very excited. I slept pretty good last night, and I got, a more normal day today as far as schedule goes. So very excited. So today's show is on a movie, and also this is kind of on how I discovered one of my favorite directors, um, and that is Herschell Gordan Lewis. He is one of my all-time favorite directors in the world of horror. He really is. I think when it comes to, he's renowned and looked at as the godfather of gore, the king of splatter. He was the first guy that really started, and introduced copious amounts of blood in movies. He really was the guy who did that. And it's interesting because on how I discovered him, and this show is going to be about the first movie I ever saw of his, and it was probably about, I think it was about probably 4 years ago now. I was pretty late to the game on discovering Herschel Gordon Lewis. And when I discovered his work, the first movie I ever saw of his was 2000 Maniacs from 1964. And so I'm going to talk about this movie and talk a little bit about how I got into him and what he means to me, but then talk mainly about this movie. I got into him after seeing a compilation, a Grindhouse compilation, and I was just like enamored with it. I was just like, this is unlike anything I've ever seen. It's on two levels. It's like it's absolutely awful and just trash, and it's gross, but I just think it's amazing and so fun and just totally wild and kind of insane. And since then, the last few years, I pretty much own all of his movies, and I have all of his movies on Blu-ray. I have all of these really beautiful editions of his films, and they're amazing. They're amazing packages. Arrow put out all of these releases a few years back, and they're just amazing. These movies are some of my favorite exploitation movies, and just as being a collector of movies, these are some of my favorite movies that I own. The quality, the what you get for the bang for your buck is just incredible. So like it was probably about 4 or 5 years ago. I went to Opera House Video, and I've talked about this movie before. I think I believe I've done a show on this movie before, but it's so good and it's such a classic. I watched it the other night, and this movie was the first of his films, first of many of his films that I saw, but this was the first one. This is the one that kind of ignited that spark as far as wow, stuff like this actually exists. And it was about 5 years ago. I was at Opera House Video, and I was going there renting movies, and I came across like they have a, if you dig around, they have a pretty decent selection of exploitation movies and really low budget horror movies. You have to search around, but they actually have quite a few there, and they have a few of these kind of collections of like drive-in grindhouse movies there. Where it's like a little bit of it's like a mini box set. It has like 2 or 3 discs. It's a DVD collection, and there's like 10 or 12 movies on these discs of all of these really low budget, obscure exploitation movies. And I got this one there at Opera House Video, and one of the films on this. There was a lot of great movies on this in this collection, but the movie that stood out probably the most was 1964's 2000 Maniacs. And I was just again, I was like, this is like I never seen anything so trashy, and I never seen anything so fun and and at the same time something so just wild, just crazy. And I just like became obsessed with Herschell Gordan Lewis, and he's become one of my favorite filmmakers, one of my favorite directors. And it was probably I got this movie. The first movie of his that I bought was Blood Feast, but this I probably got a couple of years ago. Blood Feast is probably my favorite of all of his films. The interesting thing, like the kind of the path I found, the way I found him, and the kind of the trajectory. Again, I've said how I got into horror films. My first kind of slasher films that I ever saw was, of course, Halloween as a kid, the Friday 13th movies. I was raised on that stuff, and then, and then I did see. I also got exposed to Lucio Fulci pretty young too. House by the Cemetery was a movie I remember seeing a lot as a kid. I also remember seeing the films by Dario Argento, Suspiria. So, the more popular of the kind of cult horror, Italian horror films, exploitation movies that came out at that time. So I had a pretty good dose and exposure to Italian cinema as a kid. And as I got older, I got way into horror. Those are the first movies that I saw as a kid, and I really got into horror, and it's become my main thing right now, and it probably will always be. But it's interesting tracing back the trajectory, because the first of those movies, say 78 with Halloween and then Friday the 13th coming out right after that, 79, 80, and then you had 81, 82, and then throughout the 80s, the rest of the movies came out. Those are the first movies I ever saw where they were slasher movies, and they were also like the first time I ever saw blood and gore in film and practical effects. Those movies were my introduction to the world of practical effects. And it was, a magical time. And even to this day, practical effects for me are where it's at. There's no substitute. And tracing kind of where all of this stuff came from, I was like, okay, this is where, like the Friday 13th movie, for instance, at that time and for years, I thought, okay, this movie more or less kind of was the first film to kind of show copious amounts of gore, practical effects, people getting, killed in all kinds of creative ways. Halloween obviously is very much a slasher film. There isn't the. It's more of a. With that film, I've always felt like it's more about the atmosphere. It's not. It's not really as far as the gore factor. I mean, it's 100%. It's an iconic movie. It's one of the greatest films ever made. It's and it's one of the greatest and one of the most influential slasher movies of all time. But when it comes to the gore, it's not very gore soaked like say Friday 13th. It is very much more about just kind of the atmosphere. And so, but I believe for a long time, okay, Friday 13th was the first movie that kind of did that, that kind of introduced that element to films and slasher films. And I always looked at that as being kind of this stepping stone. But as I got, it kind of it set the precedent. But then as I got more into horror films, and especially more recently, obviously, where I became a film fanatic, even more so, and started collecting more movies, I have gotten really into Italian horror. There's so many great, Bruno Mattei, just so many great Dario Gento, like I said, Lucio Fulci, so many great Sergio Martino, so many great directors, and so I got really into, and again, it's one of my favorite worlds in cinema is the Italian world of horror and exploitation and giallo. It's just it's an amazing period in cinema. And those films are, have copious amounts of violence in them. And so I was like, and they, predate Friday 13th. As I was kind of getting into these films more and more, I was like, oh, wait, no. I kind of looked at, well, I think Lucio Fulci was the guy who kind of started it. Or the Italians were the ones who started this gore kind of factor in films and the real sleazy factor. So I was like, okay, that Friday 13th did not start it. It actually you can trace it back to like the early 70s. And so I kind of felt that was where it started. Like directors like Lucio Fulci were the first guys to kind of show that kind of violence on screen in horror. But as I was like, and then when I got into Herschell Gordan Lewis, I was like, oh wow, no, it goes back even further to the 60s, 63, 64. And I was like, holy shit, like the picture of this is much bigger. And that's when I came to the conclusion that actually, Herschell Gordan Lewis was the first the first director to introduce those elements to horror films with literally no budget whatsoever. And it's amazing. So I like traced the lineage of something that I really love in slasher films and in horror films in general, and went down that rabbit hole, and through lots of movie watching and reading and all of these things, I was like, wow, like that is really interesting. So it didn't start in 79 or 78 or 80 or 81. It actually started in like 63. And the first Herschell Gordon Lewis film, Blood Feast, which was his biggest movie in his entire career, which is just an astounding movie and on so many levels, because it's so astoundingly bad, but just also it's pure magic. It's so fun, and it's super gory and it's just so ridiculous and you kind of it's one of like seeing his films and especially that film. It's kind of like this experience of where you're like, wow, how did this get made? And just the fact that where we live now in this we're kind of in this golden age that all of these movies that were so low budget, so obscure, and fell into the caverns of history have come back, and now they're getting all these beautiful additions. His second film that he did was 2000 Maniacs, and that film was regarded by him himself was that he felt that this was his best movie. This movie is amazing. It is a movie that is so unpolitically correct. This would never get made now because it's so. I watched this. I've seen this movie so many times, almost to the point where I can't really count how many times I've seen them. And I get something different from this movie every time. Like I forgot. I watched this the other night and I kind of forgot how incredibly gory and just like brutal this movie is. Along with it being just so trashy, like so unbelievably trashy. So there's like it does give a little levity to it because the violence in this movie is brutal as fuck, but it's so you know for all intents and purposes it's so poorly executed that it makes it like comical. So it's easier to digest as if it was like just really serious and like technically proficient. It would be more unsettling, I guess. But this is such a classic, such a masterpiece. And Herschel Gordon Lewis went on to have such an amazing career, so many great films. But this movie has a special place for me for obvious reasons because it came out in '64. Again, it's one of those things where I'm blown away that this came out in '64. Like when you think that how shocking this movie is even now, and how I really legitimately feel like this movie could not be made today. On how talk about being a trailblazer. I mean, it's crazy. It's crazy. Basically, and I think there's a lot of people. There's like two camps. I think there's a lot of people who are into the exploitation world. And it's a very hardcore fan base. I include myself in that fan base. Everyone who's kind of a part of that knows who Herschel Gordon Lewis is. They regard him as being kind of the man. So that's like a fact. Outside of that, I think there are a lot of people who have no idea who Herschel Gordon Lewis is. I think when it comes to horror, I think there's a lot more people who are more familiar, say, with Dario Argento than they would be with Herschel Gordon Lewis. Herschel Gordon Lewis was an American director, but I think way more underground. He didn't have like you take for instance Suspiria. That was a major commercial success. That was really a major successfully distributed film, and Herschel Gordon Lewis is definitely on the underground. He's like a punk rock maverick as far as I'm concerned, or was. But being a fan of horror, and I think his films really, really influence a lot of directors, in a lot of ways. Um, and I honestly think that like Gore, even though a lot of people are not aware of him in certain circles, I honestly feel that without him being part of this totally bizarre, crazy part of cinema history, I think horror films now, even to this day, they would be quite a bit different. Things would be different. I don't think they would be where they were at, or even with the slasher genre, for instance. As far as the use of practical effects in the horror exploitation world into itself, I don't think they would be the same. I mean, these movies were made in the '60s, which predates everything. Even when you look at a movie like, say, Black Christmas, which is one of the probably the most important slasher movie ever made. That came out in the mid '70s, and that predated Halloween, which influenced Halloween. All of the incredible Canadian exploitation movies. But Herschel Gordon Lewis was even before that, and So historically, it's like it's amazing when you think of it. You know, even though he didn't take himself seriously, and he wasn't like. In some ways, it's almost hard to like reference him as a filmmaker. You know, but an amazing movie. This movie is just a piece of. It's a trash masterpiece. It's one of the greatest exploitation movies, one of the greatest horror exploitation movies ever made. I highly recommend it. Blood Feast is probably my favorite. So many other movies to his credit. This package is amazing. Like all of these editions is incredible because they all come with two movies. There's all kinds of special features on here. These movies were put out shortly before Herschell Gordon Lewis passed away, unfortunately. So there's all these great interviews with him on here. Just a world of knowledge. So interesting. Love, love, love me some Herschell Gordon Lewis. And this is one of his best movies. Probably my second favorite. This was the movie that got me into his work. So yeah, you can't get enough. You can't go wrong with Herschell Gordon Lewis. So thanks again, and we will see you next time. Peace.